take over. Okay. Am I audible? Perfect. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. First, let me start off by saying my words of gratitude. I am truly grateful for the presence of everyone that is here today. Today's topic of discussion is one that is most relevant, especially with everything that is currently happening in the world. My duty is really brief. I'm just going to inform you of what we'll be doing today, and then we'll take it from there. I will be welcoming Prof Petersen to the podium. This will be followed by Prof Sooklal's lecture. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a closing. Without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please help me in introducing our Rector, Prof Francis Petersen.
Well, thank you very much, Program Director, for introducing me, and an hearty welcome to all of our members in the audience this afternoon. I know that we probably would have had a little bit more students here this afternoon, but they're probably preparing for the examinations. But those that are here, I hope that you're going to enjoy the lecture and obviously also the panel discussion that will follow. So the title of the talk this afternoon from our guest speaker, which I will introduce a little bit later, is the role of BRICS, the BRICS countries, which obviously is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The role of BRICS in shaping the emerging international order. And that certainly is something, a topic that's on the mind of many people, even within our university in South Africa, to a large extent, and very much emphasized again when we had, and we're still in the midst of our COVID pandemic. It hasn't ended. But when we were at the thrust of the pandemic in the beginning of 2019, in the middle of 2019, there'd been a whole discussion about vaccine development, and if you do have the vaccines, how do you distribute the vaccines? There had been a discussion around when we are looking at the global north, if you want to travel. At that point, and we couldn't travel, but there was a focus on what I would probably call a high degree of nationalism, and that nationalism were mostly experienced in the global north, and people questioned that. On the one hand, there was the issue of solidarity, where we would say, well, this is about humanity, and we need to make sure that we deal with that from that perspective. On the other hand, it was the nationalism that indicate that if we've got our boundaries and our borders, if we can protect our borders, we would not allow people from other countries, and specifically from say, the global south, to enter our borders because we want to keep our nation safe. And then with the vaccine rollout, we also find and use the term vaccine nationalism, where there was specific strategies initially to say, well, let us first look at ourselves and then look at the rest. And in that equation, it was often the global south that were impacted, and the, I would say, emerging countries, the underdeveloped countries, developing countries that were impacted. And the question that arose during that time was the functions of global institutions. You know, the World Health Organization, the G7, the G20, the World Bank, and whether they haven't outlived their current mandates in a way, or their their current strategies, their agendas, and whether there should not be reforms that should take place in those global institutions. And as part of our engagement, we had, as part of our Global Citizen program, I had a conversation with Jeffrey Sachs on that as well. There was one of the people that we had an engagement with, specifically on global institutions, and are they acting as they've been adjusted to be able to talk about this new world order. And in fact, the BRICS countries also have developed a voice, and I would say probably a very, very strong voice, and a voice where there is a level of high cooperation. But the question is, does those global institutions, and specifically also the global north, are they recognizing the voice? Are they giving enough space for that voice to be heard and to obviously impact the thinking? And I'm giving that background because that is really what our guest speaker will be trying to unpack, amongst others. I'm pretty sure there's much more that our guest speaker will talk about. But it will be quite interesting to hear his thoughts, because he's in the engine of those discussions. So our guest speaker this afternoon is Ambassador Sooklal. He served as Deputy Director General responsible for Asia and the Middle East in the Department of International Relations and Cooperations until the 31st of January 2022, this year. And he also served as the South African ambassador to the European Union, to Belgium and Luxembourg from 2006 to 2012, and also at the South African missions in Geneva and New Delhi. Before joining government in 1995, he followed an academic career at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and also at the University of South Africa, UNISA. Ambassador Sooklal has published more than 20 articles, which obviously giving a sense of his academic pedigree, but also his understanding of intellectual foundations and engagements. And he published these 20 articles, both local and international journals. He's a recipient of several fellowships and awards, which include the internship in human rights in the United Nations Center for Human Rights in Geneva. He's adjunct professor of the Fujian Agriculture and Forest University in China, senior adjunct fellow for research and information systems for developing countries. He was a member of the board of the South African Council for Sustainable Development. He also was conferred the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Award by the government of India, and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Indian Ocean Rim Studies. So clearly, Ambassador Sooklal has got a lot of experience of international relations, a lot of experience in different areas, and I think he's the right person to talk about this specific topic, which is the role of BRICS in shaping the emerging international order. Ambassador Sooklal, we're certainly looking forward to your talk, and once again, welcome for the first time at the University of the Free State. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor Francis Petersen, Vice-Chancellor and Rector of UFS, Prof Burger, Prof Solomon, Prof Prakash, Ms Mosibudi, dear friends. Let me say how pleased I am to be here. I was saying to Professor earlier on that I had an invitation to visit this university way back in 2010 when I was still based in Brussels, when Professor Johnson visited us at the embassy and extended an invitation to come to Free State University. Unfortunately, I never got that opportunity. And I was also mentioning to Professor and the colleagues that the Mangaung municipality is twinned with the city of Ghent in Belgium. And in 2008, we had a very large delegation coming to Ghent as part of the Ghent Expo, where Mangaung was the chief guest. And we had a delegation of over 120 or so, many from this university. So I was saying to Professor, I think we should try and strengthen those bonds between Belgium and South Africa. And I think the university can be a catalyst in this process. But also, let me express my deep appreciation to you, Professor, and to the university community for giving me this privilege this afternoon to come and share with you some ideas on BRICS. I've been involved with BRICS now for the past 11 years, initially as sous Sherpa and now as Sherpa for the past 7 years. So I have a deep passion about what we are doing with BRICS, and I hope I will share some of those insights with you. But before I come to my paper, I want to say that we are meeting at a very critical juncture of human history, not just because one of our BRICS countries is involved in a major conflict at the moment. I will speak a bit to that. But what Thomas Friedman, and I'm sure students of international relations would have read his book, The World is Flat, but Thomas Friedman has described this period as the age of accelerations. And basically what he's saying is that a number of issues are accelerating at a heightened speed and impacting on the human psyche. These include issues such as biodiversity and climate change, globalization, and more recently, the issue of the pandemic, and of course, even more recently, conflict. And therefore, we are living in an age what some political scientists have attached the acronym VUCA, an age of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's precisely what this decade at least is going to be, a very uncertain decade, unpredictable, and many challenges. And of course, one of the other factors that's impacting on the human psyche is the advent of new technologies and how it's displacing human beings, the artificial intelligence, robotics, and so forth. And we have to deal with all of these simultaneously. And I hope I will touch on some of these issues. Let me say that for a number of years now, South Africa has been working with friends across all regional groups to be catalysts for change in our respective regions, actively mobilizing others to support real reforms of the UN, to make it more inclusive and responsive to the needs of the developing world. In 2019, we endorsed the Alliance for Multilateralism, an initiative that was put forward at the UN, wherein it states, no single country, no matter how powerful and wealthy, can seek to assume for itself the global unilateral monopoly on seeking solutions to all the world's problems. The multilateral system should be based on common and shared values. It should set norms and standards that should find universal application without exception and should be at the service of humanity and not the narrow interests of the few. The outcomes of multilateral negotiations should be fair and balanced and benefit all of humanity. However, only a few years later, we find that our alliance partners believe that the multilateral system should be at their exclusive service during times of conflict and hardship for their region. We find that there is no room for discussion or dialogue on issues that touch their primary security interest. One of President Biden's favorite phrases at the moment is that the world is at an inflection point in history, which he defines as a moment where things are changing so rapidly that we have to be in control. He speaks of a battle for supremacy between democracies, represented by the USA, and autocracies, represented by China in its trade war, and now Russia in its actual war. I believe the USA and the West do not view this moment as a battle for supremacy, do view this moment as a battle for supremacy. due to the zero-sum lens they apply to international relations. We have also seen an escalation of tensions with certain members of the international community manipulating the United Nations system, the Bretton Woods institutions, and even sporting federations to purposefully exclude Russia and Russian citizens from as many international and multilateral bodies and processes as possible. The rhetoric is not just limited to Russia. For the USA, the battle for supremacy is with China. It's perhaps no coincidence that this inflection point occurs almost exactly 200 years after China dominated the global economy with almost 40% of the world's GDP in 1820. The trade war against China echoes that applied to Japan in the 1980s over fears that the US would lose its #1 economic position to Japan. And many of you know the history of what transpired in that period and where Japan ended up. Many in the developed world style themselves as defenders of an international rules-based order with the UN at the center, defenders of human rights and fundamental freedoms, defenders of multilateralism, and defenders of the United Nations Charter and its principles. However, in its reactions to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, NATO has returned to the old antagonistic paradigm of the Cold War. Multilateralism is being deliberately weakened amidst attempts to change the agendas of international organizations to serve the interests of only a few. Perhaps, colleagues, this is the real inflection point. If the UN guarantees the shared ideals and common aims of the peoples, how do we ensure that these ideals and aims are not merely aspirational, but achievable? Do we allow the rules, rights, and privileges of multilateralism to only apply to a privileged few, as is the case at the moment? Who will step in to safeguard the relevance and importance of inclusive multilateralism? Who will take up the reins where they have been abandoned by those who profess to be the champions of multilateralism? Who will ensure that the emerging international order is more fair, just, inclusive, equitable, and representative? I will argue that BRICS has an opportunity, working in partnership with the international community, to shape and play a leading role in the emerging international order. I will outline the role BRICS is playing in shaping the current international order and examine how BRICS has used its common values on reform to develop mutual interest across a broad range of issues. I will also critically examine the challenges and obstacles to BRICS' ambitions for global economic and political governance reform, and discuss opportunities for BRICS to reshape the emerging international order, given broad developing country concerns about the abuse of the international system by those who continue to shape and control the current world order. Isn't it ironic that the countries that possess military or economic might reserve the right to make and enforce the rules, but are also the very first to break those rules? The historical narrative on BRICS begins long before 2001, when Goldman Sachs, Jim O'Neill, I'm sure you're all familiar with Jim O'Neill, presented an analytical report which first popularized the acronym discussing BRIC countries without the S as the likely future leaders of the global economy. Now, I'm sure that Jim O'Neill was influenced by the World Bank report of 1998. Jim O'Neill coined this term in 2001. But if you go back to the World Bank report of 1998, it cites 5 emerging economies that should be on the watch list as breakout economies. It included Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Indonesia. Now, the only reason I think Jim O'Neill omitted Indonesia, because Indonesia was in political turmoil. The Suharto regime that ruled Indonesia for almost 30 years, from 1968 to 1998, and took the country, unfortunately, downwards in the latter years. Suharto did a lot of good in the initial years, but he started dragging the country down, and you had civil unrest, and that country was in turmoil. And I believe that's why the I was left out of BRIC. The cooperation between BRIC members doesn't begin at this first meeting of BRICS foreign ministers in 2006, nor the first summit in 2009, nor at the BRICS summit in 2011 when South Africa was made a full member of the BRICS family. We as BRICS share a common history of struggle against imperialism, colonialism, racism, exploitation, and underdevelopment. The foundations of South-South cooperation were laid at the first Africa-Asia Summit in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955, where Asian and African leaders, 29 of them, agreed to develop socio-political, economic, and cultural cooperation and demanded increased representation for developing countries in the United Nations. South Africa was represented at that conference in the form of the African National Congress, not by the apartheid regime, but by Moses Kotane and Molvi Kachalia of the ANC, where they went and championed our cause for freedom and democracy, and which was embraced by that first Asia-Africa Summit in 1955. The conference took place during the collapse of colonialism, independence struggles, and at the height of the Cold War. The Bandung Conference resulted in the formation of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in 1961, which remains the template for South-South cooperation and solidarity today, particularly its principles towards creating a more inclusive, equitable international environment. NAM and its sister formation, the Group of 77 and China that was formed in 1964, brought the demand for democracy and global governance into international organizations such as the UN. The developing world introduced a rich diversity of voices and opinions to multilateralism and crucially began to question the structure, procedures, and decisions of these organizations. We are driven by shared interest as we share a common vision of the world of the future, namely one in which countries of the Global South have a say in organizations as well as the opportunity and the power to reshape the global structure and the rules to benefit all, including the Global South. It is no coincidence that the debate was moved outside the global governance system when the G7 was established in 1975 to discuss and coordinate solutions to major global issues. The G7 consolidated power and influence in a limited number of states with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo and preserving economic and political power. You'll recall that the G7 first met informally at the level of foreign ministers in 1973, and the first summit was held in 1975 with France and Germany co-sponsoring that summit. It was not G7 at that stage, it was G6. It is only from 1976, a year after the first summit, that Canada was brought on board. They were the eight most powerful economies at that stage. The largest economy at that stage in 1975 was the USA with a GDP of about $1.7 trillion US. Incidentally, China's GDP in 1975 was not even 10% of the USA's GDP. It was just 160 billion. The second largest economy of that period was the USSR at about $640 billion. But of course, they didn't want the USSR in this exclusive club, so you took the third up to the eighth place that formed the G7. When the G7 was initiated, and much later, the G8 in 1998, when Russia was brought in for a brief period before they were expelled in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. When they decided that it needed the buy-in of leading emerging market and developing countries to give its decision legitimacy, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and South Africa were invited to what they call the Outreach 5. However, the Outreach 5 were never included in the full agenda of the G8, their participation being limited to topics such as climate change and development. Let me say, South Africa was instrumental in starting the outreach of the G8. It didn't start with the G5. It started with Africa. As early as 2000, when the G8 was meeting in Okinawa, the Okinawa Summit in Japan. Japan was chairing the G8. Earlier that year, the African, well, it was the OAU still. It wasn't the AU. AU was formed in 2002. The OAU, at the summit level meeting in January of 2000, tasked 3 African leaders, President Mbeki, Bouteflika, and Obasanjo, Algeria, South Africa, and Nigeria, to go and interact with the G8 about Africa's development. We hadn't started NIPAD then. And we started lobbying to be invited. And I know I was involved. I was then in charge of Asia, chief director, not yet a DDG. And I spoke to the Japanese, and they point blank told us it will never happen. The G8 doesn't meet with leaders from outside its region. But of course, we lobbied all of them and put a lot of pressure. And for the first time, the G8 met with a group outside of the G8, and that was Africa. And that's where NEPAD started, because they told the three leaders, you go back and come with a blueprint in terms of what you want for Africa and how we can play a role. My glasses is giving up on me. I think it's tired already. I hope you are not getting tired. But that's where the outreach really started in 2000, and it was President Mbeki's idea. Even though Bouteflika and Obasanjo were involved, I was involved in that process. And that's where NEPAD started, from this first outreach. It is not surprising that many countries in the developed world try to undermine the relationship between BRICS members, highlighting the political differences and ignoring the commonalities and shared vision. The response, however, has never been the obvious one, which would be to make existing bodies more inclusive and representative. In 2023, the G7 will mark 50 years since the informal grouping first met as the library group, as I pointed out. And it remains today the same exclusive elite club as it began. China and India, which are today larger economies, the second largest and fifth largest economies in the world today, larger than Italy and Canada that are full G7 members, remain on the margins, while smaller economies such as Italy and Canada remain seated at the high table, pronouncing on the global economic and financial decisions. Dear friends, it should not have been a surprise when leading emerging market and developing economies began to converge outside of the outreach of the G7. India, Brazil, and South Africa agreed to form IPSA in 2003 to promote cooperation among countries of the Global South. There's a history to that, again, where President Mbeki was involved, but if I go into that history, you will have to sit here for another hour, and I'm sure you're getting tired already. But I was involved in that process. I led the first senior official meeting to Brasilia for the first IPSA meeting. India and China also met as RICS, the RICS, as we call it, at various levels since 2003 at the foreign minister level, and more recently they have meeting at summit level. We have also elevated IPSA to summit level. But interestingly, it was a G8 member. It was Russia who first initiated BRICS. Now, you'd have to ask yourself this question, and I'm putting it to you. I'm not going to give you the answer. You are students, many of you, of international relations. Why would the full G8 member, Russia, want to start another group with the Global South? The first BRIC ministerial meeting in September 2006 on the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York, with a focus on expanding multilateral cooperation between leading emerging market and developing countries. The first BRIC summit was then held in Russia in 2009, where the leaders outlined the goals of BRIC in the media statement, and they stated the following: promote dialogue and cooperation among our countries in an incremental, proactive, pragmatic, open, and transparent way. The dialogue and cooperation of the BRIC countries is conducive not only to serving common interests of emerging market economies and developing countries, but also to building a harmonious world of lasting peace and common prosperity. The leaders also took up the call for global economic governance reform by calling for emerging economies to have a greater voice in international financial institutions and a more diversified global monetary system. The global monetary system is still dollar-based, dominated by the IMF and World Bank, and the heads of these institutions rotate between EU member states and the US. Up to today, we've not had a head of the Bretton Woods institution from outside Europe and the USA in 2022. South Africa recognized that the global environment at the time presented an opportunity for greater political and economic role for BRICS and other emerging powers. South Africa was invited to become a full member of BRICS in 2011. I recall I was still in Brussels, and when one of our cabinet ministers came, I asked her, why are we not in BRICS? And she indicated to me, why should we be in BRICS? I said, BRIC cannot be complete without Africa. You cannot create a global power bloc without an African voice. We are marginalized in the Security Council, a continent of almost 1.4 billion, an organization started in 1945, and in 2022, Africa is not in the Security Council. Great injustice, and we continue fighting that fight. And I said that we have to be in BRICS, and BRICS recognized when we started championing that they will not be a voice, they will be an incomplete voice on the global stage if you do not have an African voice. And the national partner, of course, was South Africa, and they invited us to become a full member. With the addition of South Africa, the 5 members of BRICS collectively today account for 41% of the world population, 26% of the landmass of the globe across 4 continents, and 25% of global GDP and 20% of world trade. This demonstrates why BRICS was founded as a forum of like-minded countries, progressive emerging market and developing countries committed to restructuring of the global political, economic, and financial architecture to be more equitable, balanced, and resulting on the important pillars of multilateralism and international law. Prof Petersen, I'm halfway through my paper, so I hope you're not falling asleep. You can bear with me for another 20 minutes. Our diverse economies, development paths, populations, biodiversity, natural resources, cultures, and histories also provide fertile ground for practical BRICS cooperation. This diversity also generates its own challenges, particularly in trying to align diverse government levels, bureaucracies, and processes to find a home for new areas of cooperation. We fight a lot as Sherpas. We have very robust battles, but there's a sense of community that underpins this solidarity. However, BRICS members have approached this cooperation in a spirit of openness and solidarity, with a genuine intention to find mutual interest and common values, in a manner that continues to defy the pessimistic predictions of many in the Western world. Over the last 15 years, cooperation has grown exponentially across a broad range of sectors and now covers 3 pillars. We have 3 pillars of BRICS cooperation: the political and security, the economic and finance, and the social and people-to-people pillars. And no pillar is more important. Each of those 3 pillars are critically important, including South Africa also champions. BRICS is not about governments. BRICS is about our people. It must speak to our people and to their aspirations. Government is only the enabling factor to bring about this alliance between ourselves. When South Africa chaired BRICS in 2013, we held around 40 meetings at various levels across all pillars. China, as the current chair of BRICS this year, is chairing around 180 meetings. Now, just to show you, and the success of BRICS is not measured in the number of meetings. 2013, we chaired 43. In 2018, when we chaired, we hosted close to 140 meetings, and I'm sure when we chair next year, it will be close to 200 meetings. But it shows you the depth of our cooperation, but more importantly, the substantive areas of cooperation. Because if you find a sector not part of it, I just chaired a meeting on Monday. We have a stakeholder meetings across government, civil society, and what we call track 1, 2, and 3. Track 1 being government, track 2 being the business community, the university community, and track 3 being civil society. And we had all of them for the second workshop. And one of the things that's being pushed by South Africa, by our youth, is that we need to create a BRICS Youth Forum. We don't have it yet, and I think it's a good suggestion. The Chairship of BRICS rotates annually among the members according to the acronym. As chair, you set the priorities and calendar of events for the year, as well as hosting the summit. The terms of reference for BRICS encourage the chair to develop its annual priorities in close consultation with other BRICS members based on the chair's agenda, as well as previously agreed decisions. The coordination is managed through a Sherpa and a sous-Sherpa, like a sous-chef. Your sous-Sherpa is your deputy. I was a deputy for about 3 years, and since 2016, I am now the Sherpa. All BRICS decisions are taken in consultation with other BRICS members and are based upon consensus. The political and security pillar is the backbone of the cooperation of our leaders, usually meeting twice a year, once during the summit, and we have a mandatory meeting. When we meet during the G20. I was Sherpa for G20 for 5 years. We also have a BRICS leaders meeting. We caucus positions and see where within the G20 we can have common position and support each other. The G7 have its own caucus. They also meet on the side before they come into the meeting. Despite the G7 meeting, you also have the EU. The EU members will meet and caucus. But we also have an emerging market and developing country grouping out of the 20, of which about half are EMDCs. We also meet and caucus. So there's a lot of caucusing going because the meeting is about positioning and influencing outcomes. While changing domestic, regional, and global dynamics can pose challenges to common positions in the political and security pillar, the BRICS members agree on more than they disagree. There's far more points of intersection than points of divergence within our grouping. And BRICS consistently claims its space in meeting to discuss political and security issues of global relevance, even when the discussions may be frank and robust. BRICS constantly and consistently calls for a deepened international consensus on multilateralism, respect for international law, and a reformed global order that is equitable, inclusive, and representative. For South Africa, it is important that like-minded voices of the Global South are heard in global peace and security issues. And South Africa aims to explore concrete ways towards projecting a stronger and more united progressive BRICS voice on these issues wherever possible, including on peace and security in the African continent. For example, despite diverse positions in the UN on the Middle East peace process and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, recently we had our foreign ministers meet about 3 weeks ago, and we had a consensus statement on both the Russia-Ukraine conflict as well as the Middle East peace process. Colleagues, BRICS cooperation is not only ideological, it is practical and aims to prove tangible benefits to its people. The economic and financial pillar is where South Africa leverages our partnership with the locomotives of global economic growth towards addressing our triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, as well as South Africa's post-pandemic economic recovery through increased trade, investment, tourism, capacity building, skills, and technology transfer. South Africa's trade with BRICS increased by an average growth of 10% over the last 5 years, annually. For South Africa, over 17% of its 2021 exports were destined for BRICS countries, while it sourced 29% of its imports from BRICS partners. Total trade with BRICS reached $726 billion in 2021, up from $487 billion in 2017. Interestingly, when you had the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, you had a number, if you follow Twitter, you would have followed this development, a number of EU ambassadors very critical of South Africa's position, the position that we took based on the statement that was put out by Minister Pandor and also by our president. They wanted us to outright criticize Russia and support the EU-US position. We took a balanced view of the conflict. And one of the tweets that came from one of the European ambassadors was a very threatening tweet. It's not how diplomats behave. That's very unbecoming, where in the host country, you criticize the host country. And she put out a tweet saying, are you jeopardizing over 700 billion rands of trade with the EU? I was almost tempted to put out a tweet that you are EU 27 with 700 billion of trade. We, with BRICS, just the 4 BRICS countries, our trade is 726 billion. But it wasn't a tit-for-tat situation, so I let it go. Trade with China remains significantly larger than the other BRICS nations, accounting for 73% of South Africa's export for BRICS. Don't get me wrong, I love the European Union. I spent 6 years of my life there as ambassador to the EU. The EU is a very important strategic partner of South Africa. Trade diversification remains a priority for South Africa, and multiple opportunities exist for South African trade with BRICS. Implementation of the BRICS Action Plan for the Strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership is one of the engines that we have to deepen intra-BRICS trade. We had the first 5-year plan that expired last year, and we now adopted a new 5-year plan. In support of BRICS economic recovery, in support of global economic recovery, BRICS has agreed to strengthen collaboration in catalytic sectors such as energy, information technology, science, technology and innovation, agriculture, the green economy. These are all important sectors identified in South Africa's Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. Significant achievements have been made in the area of financial cooperation with the establishment of the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, as we call it, and the NDB, the New Development Bank. The CRA is a social safety net with a capital of $100 billion. So should South Africa or any BRICS country fall into financial distress, we don't have to go to the IMF to borrow. We can borrow from within our BRICS. We have created the CRA fund as a safety net. Fortunately, none of us have had to go and draw on the CRA. The bank is the first formal institution established by BRICS, and it plays a critical role in providing financial and project preparation support for infrastructure, sustainable development projects in South Africa and Africa. The bank is headquartered in Shanghai, and last year China was very benevolent. They put up a 13-story building right on the shore of the Hangpo River. If you ever go to Shanghai, feel free to visit it because it is also our bank. We have an equal stake in it. Each BRICS partner has an equal stake in it. We were very clear, despite China wanting a larger stake in it, that this is a partnership between equals. We know that you can put more money, but we don't want that. We want all of us to have equal stake in it, and we'll put the equal amount of capital into it. South Africa has benefited from 11 projects to date, valued at approximately $5.4 billion, which aims to improve our service delivery in critical areas. And we also saw during the outbreak of COVID, twice we received 2 tranches of $1 billion to help us with our COVID recovery and to deal with COVID. So we got $2 billion in 2020 and 2021. To date, BRICS is just 5 years old as a bank. It has disbursed over $30 billion in loans to the five BRICS countries, as I've indicated. We account for 19% of that lending. China 25, India 24, we 19, Brazil 18%, and Russia 15%. So it has been a positive development. The global rating agencies has given it a very positive rating. Standard & Poor's and Moody has given it an A+ rating, which is a very good sovereign rating for a new bank. And we have floated several green bonds. Just last week, China floated a 7 billion renminbi green bond. The renminbi is about 2.5 to 1, so that you're looking at about 18, 19 billion rands green bond. The first bond of about 30 billion that was first floated about 3 years ago was oversubscribed. The importance of the social and people-to-people cooperation pillar was revealed in the BRICS response to COVID-19. BRICS is not a forum for political point scoring or a race to profit off the pandemic. Instead, we focused on collaboration aimed at ensuring benefit flow to all, including Africa and the poorest of the poor. All tracks of the BRICS cooperation were reprioritized to address health, economic, and social devastation of the pandemic. The pandemic reminded us of the importance of research and innovation in the development of a vaccine and the need to ensure affordable access to quality and effective healthcare and diagnostic tools. The launch of the BRICS Vaccine Research and Development Center in March this year by our Minister Nzimande was in attendance, is an important example of BRICS best practice in international health and science cooperation to prepare for future crises. The operationalization of the Vaccine Center delivers on the agreement made during the Johannesburg Summit in 2018, where under South Africa's chairship, we put this as one of the priority. This was our innovation as the legacy project of 2018. Our legacy project of 2013, we created the BRICS Business Council. That was South Africa's proposal. We created the BRICS Think Tank Council. That was South Africa's proposal. And it was in Durban at the 13 summit, that the decision was taken to create the New Development Bank. So South Africa has been at the center of very important developments within BRICS. And also the BRICS Business Council was created during our chairship in 2013. BRICS is also a platform for sharing and learning and is open to new ideas and directions. BRICS Education Cooperation has resulted in the establishment of the network of BRICS universities in 2018. Now, I've been saying to Prof Petersen and to the colleagues here that I'm very disappointed when I visit our universities in South Africa. I'm always championing the need for you to look at research. I was pointing out that the University of Toronto has a BRICS Center, a full-time BRICS Center, and annually they put out a publication measuring the success of BRICS as per the decisions of the summit. And I said this to our academia. Why is it that Toronto is doing it and not one of our think tanks or universities? The BRICS Post is an online publication published from London. Now, we need to reclaim the space, and I'm appealing to UFS as well to become part of the BRICS processes. And I would want you as students, especially postgraduate students, to start looking at BRICS. The G7 is going to be 50 years old. The BRICS, we are only 15 years old. But in that 15 years, we have traveled a great distance, and we are not going to fade. And if anything, BRICS is going to get stronger over the coming years. We've established the BRICS Think Tank Council, BRICS Academic Forum, and the Civil BRICS Forum. Other track structures under Track 3 include supporting cooperation, including annual meetings of youth, labor, political parties, and parliamentarians. As I've said, we have chaired, Prof, how much time do I have left?
I think you could probably, I don't know, you've got another 5 minutes or so.
Let me come to conclusion. I will skip the section on cooperation. I think most of you are aware of cooperation. Just to say that the bank expanded membership last year. As we said, BRICS is not just about the 5 of us. We are on an expansion process on membership of the banks. Bangladesh, Egypt, Uruguay, and United Arab became the first members of the expanded membership, and we are continuing this year. There will be a further tranche of expansion. Let me come to some of my concluding remarks, and I will leave my paper for distribution. Following the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, questions have been raised about the future of BRICS. There's much been written. Does BRICS have a future? Does Russia have a future? You see constantly, every other day in Western media, Putin is suffering from Parkinson's disease. Putin has cancer. And 2 days ago, the Guardian said Putin is died and a double is sitting in the office. Now, that will give you an indication of the level of global media propaganda at the present time. Questions have been raised about the future of BRICS and whether BRICS has a role in shaping the emergent global architecture. My response is a strong affirmative. BRICS was founded on the core principles of shaping an international order that is more fair, just, inclusive, equitable, and representative. It is also focused on strengthening and reforming multilateral systems with the UN at its center. It is paramount that the global South are no longer outliers or merely witnesses to an evolving global architecture, and that includes us as Africa. BRICS is a powerful voice of the countries of the South. The BRICS Outreach and BRICS Plus programs have been embraced by countries of the South, and they have been interacting with BRICS over the last decade, including the African Union and other regional groupings. It is important that BRICS remain true to its founding principles and continue, now more so than ever, to champion the core interest of the Global South, especially overcoming political, economic, and financial marginalization. Furthermore, BRICS must continue to address the key development challenges of poverty, underdevelopment, and inequality, which have been relegated to the margins by most in the developed world. BRICS must become a force multiplier in addressing the key challenges of the developing world. South Africa's vision for BRICS has never been to create an exclusive elite club, but to harness our common vision and resources to benefit our people through tangible mutual cooperation and to actively shape the world to the benefit of all. We do not view BRICS as a forum of containment or contestation, but rather as a forum of cooperation for the mutual benefit of the international community. Let me, as a historian by training academically, let me draw on the wisdom of a Greek historian. I'm sure you're familiar with Thucydides. Thucydides was a 5th century BC Greek historian who has chronicled extensively the war between Athenia and Sparta, and also to demonstrate how the contestation for power from ancient time to the present has not really changed. And this is what Thucydides states. When a great power's position as a hegemon is threatened by an emerging power, there is significant likelihood of war between the two powers. That was Thucydides in the 5th century BC. How true that holds today. Thucydides further notes, the strong will continue to do what they can, and the weak will continue to suffer what they must. The global south is no longer weak, nor will we continue to suffer what we must. The BRICS has an important role to play in shaping the emerging international order at this critical juncture in human history. There has been much speculation in recent times about who will shape the emerging international order. We are witnessing a flurry of new geopolitical alignments and alliances, some of which breaches the traditional North-South divide. On the eve of the Russia-Ukraine war, President Xi and President Putin met on the margins of the Beijing Winter Olympics, where they declared that there are no limits to our strategic partnership. On 24th May, just a week and a half ago, the leaders of the Quad, I'm sure you're familiar with the Quad, USA, India, Japan, and Australia, met in Tokyo for the 4th time in 1 year, within 1 year, twice online and now twice in person, during which occasion they also launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework involving the Quad and 9 other countries from the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific is a different construct. As if you're following global politics, you'll know that the Quad and Indo-Pacific are different constructs. And of course, in September 2021, Australia, UK, and US launched what they call their security pact, the AUKUS. Recently, both Sweden and Finland have stated the intention to seek NATO membership. So the Ukraine war has witnessed an accelerated pace of shuttle and virtual diplomacy. We've had in South Africa, Deputy Secretary of State was here. The head of intelligence in the US State Department had a discussion with the head of, well, our advisor, Sidney Mufamadi, advisor to presidents on intelligence. Chancellor Ulov of Germany was here last week, one of his first visits since becoming Chancellor. President Ramaphosa has spoken to Zelensky, Putin, Xi, and several other leaders over the past month. So you can see that this is part of a process to wield influence, strengthen alliances, as well as forge new spheres of influence by the major powers. BRICS must continue to champion the interests of the South while also working in partnership and cooperation with the global community, including countries of the North that share a common vision of creating a global order that is underpinned by multipolarity, a rules-based international order, international law, and reinvigorated, reformed, and strengthened multilateral system with the UN at its center. We must return to the ideals of the UN Charter and build a people-centered world, as so succinctly stated in the preamble of the UN Charter, and I quote, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights in men and women and of nations large and small, and to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. My dear friends, we must work collectively to build a better world and a better life for all. We must remain optimistic despite the uncertain and complex times, and we must remain hopeful, just as we did during the dark days of our own struggle for freedom and democracy. Professor Petersen and esteemed professors, dear colleagues, thank you for giving me this privilege and welcoming me to your beautiful university and for listening to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you very much for that presentation. As you have indicated, the full presentation will be available, and we will make sure that we probably will publish it on our website for people, in fact, the whole university community to read. So I just wanted to, we have had a sort of a certain time frame that we wanted to complete this. I haven't checked with you beforehand how long the speech is going to be, and I can't stop the guest speaker midway to say, well, listen, it's time for to stop the presentation. It was very, very interesting. The panel is going to, each of the members, we're going to give 5 minutes just to do a few high-level remarks as a response, really, to your presentation. And I haven't introduced the panel members, but let me do so. The first panel member that's going to start is Professor Hussein Solomon. He's Senior Professor in Political Studies and Governance, and also Academic Head of the Department of Political Studies and Governance in the Faculty of Humanities. We also have Professor Philippe Burger, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. And then we have Ms Mosibudi Motimele, who is the lecturer in Political Studies and Governance in the Faculty of Humanities. So I'm going to ask Professor Hussein to start first, then I'm going to move to Professor Burger, and I'm going to end off with Ms Motimele.
Thank you, Professor Petersen. I think the difference between an optimist and a pessimist... working? Fine, okay. So the difference between an optimist and a pessimist, my dad once reminded me, is that a pessimist has more reliable facts on his side. My view then is more pessimistic of BRICS shaping an emerging international order. I was always suspect of this term, representing the global south, when finding that it was Jim O'Neill, a banker at Goldman Sachs, who had actually coined the term in 2001. Goldman Sachs, of course, is the epitome of the global north. O'Neill used this term, as Professor Sooklal said, to describe the economic potential of the BRIC countries. South Africa was added as an afterthought by some of the BRIC nations to have African representation. At the very beginning, this group makes and make no sense. A successful group should share common values and common strategic interests. At the values level, Russia and China are hardly democratic states. Need I mention Xinjiang and the Uyghurs and Hong Kong to this august audience? As for India, under Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, here we see a rabid Hindu fundamentalism which is inflaming communal violence and undermining security. What of strategic interests? Again, need I remind you of China and India's border clashes, which is threatening war, as well as China's growing ties with rival Pakistan, which has earned the ire of New Delhi. As for Moscow, whilst Russia is threatened by China, it also recognizes it as a necessary ally in its own rivalry with the West, more so with the war in Ukraine. What of Brazil? Jair Bolsonaro, a Trump-like figure, has articulated strong anti-China rhetoric, despite the fact that China is an important trading partner for Brazil. Unlike his predecessors from the Workers' Party, Bolsonaro's foreign policy orientation is to the West, not the global South. As for South Africa, does it actually matter? We are a failing state that cannot provide electricity or drinking water to its citizens, nor fix potholes. Can such a country really project either hard or soft power on the international stage? These BRICS nations have huge socio-economic divides within their own borders. Is it possible that countries which cannot fix their own gaps between have and have-nots, can they address global power disparities? The establishment of the new development bank was touted as an innovative new investment which would do things differently from the traditional multilateral development banks, but its approach has been rather orthodox, so no change here. My final point is to what extent BRICS and the BRICS Plus proposal is about China and its Belt and Road Initiative, wrapping its own national interests within the BRICS flag. First, make no mistake, China dominates BRICS. China's economy is 6 times that of India's, 10 times that of Brazil's and Russia's, and 55 times the size of South Africa's. Moreover, China's economic relationship with Africa, as with many of its other so-called partners, is one of neocolonialism, as the recent edition of Nigeria's Sun newspaper pointed out. What China and Russia have in common is spewing anti-West rhetoric and a narrative of decolonization while expanding their own national interests across the continent. Consider here the activities of Russia's private military contractors, the Wagner Group, on various African states. Consider the fact that 65.8% of Zambia's external debt is through loans from China. Consider the fact that 68 of the world's poorest countries will pay China $52.8 billion this year in debt servicing charges. While China is known for infrastructure development in Africa, repayments to loans for infrastructure development is often done through resources such as oil and minerals. Perhaps more worryingly is the militarization of China's presence in Africa. Having established a military presence in Djibouti, the PLA is planning bases in Ethiopia, Guinea, Kenya, Mozambique, Namibia, Senegal, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Egypt, Nigeria, Angola, Botswana, Sudan, Seychelles, Mauritius, and Zambia. This does not represent a new emancipatory order, but an old order based on national interests. Kragdadigheid, if you wish. Moreover, it constitutes a clear and present danger to South Africa's own national interests. Thank you.
That's a beauty of a panel discussion. You get different perspectives, and I think for the students that's in the audience is fantastic. Obviously, at the end, I'm going to ask Ambassador Sooklal to respond, and I'll also lift out a few things. So over to you, Philippe.
Thanks. So in September 1999, I presented a paper at a conference in Russia. And, you know, those were the last days of Boris Yeltsin. Cyril, at that time, about 8 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, everything Western was in high fashion. But we also spent time in St. Petersburg, and one evening very late, you know, we had no food all day, and we walked into a McDonald's. Right? We had McDonald's. We were South Africans in Russia having McDonald's, and I remember the big old Soviet hammer and sickle still above us next to the arches of the big M of McDonald's. Of course, in 2022, now McDonald's withdrew from Russia. They closed. In 2007, I visited Beijing, and I went to the Forbidden City. And it was a cold January day, and we had coffee in, well, Starbucks in Forbidden City. But 6 months later, Starbucks closed. Starbucks in the Forbidden City closed because it was seen as a symbol of the proliferation of Western culture. Why am I talking about this? Well, on a more important political scale, I think that what we've seen recently or in the last number of years, we've seen the relationships turn sour. We've seen that honeymoon of globalization turn sour. So we've seen increasing accusations by the US, for instance, of Chinese industrial espionage. We've seen now, since 2020, 2021, there's legislation that the US passed called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountability Act, or Accountable Act, where companies need to disclose more information, and particularly this is aimed at Chinese companies that have strong ties to the Chinese government. And then, of course, you've had the incident of Wang Wanzhou, daughter of Ren Zhengfei, who's the founder and CEO of Huawei, who was under house arrest for 2 years in Canada because the US wanted an extradition. So we see these relationships sour. So what happened? Well, I think we need to understand this in the period 1990 to about 2013, 2014. There was a symbiotic relationship between the US on the one side and China on the other hand. China was the producer of the world. The US was the big consumer. China had the big current account surplus. They exported more than they imported. The US had the big trade account deficit. They imported more than they exported. These surpluses the Chinese reinvested in, well, US Treasury bonds and Treasury bills. It went from 1 trillion, then it became 2 trillion, then it became $3 trillion of US Treasury bonds that the Chinese government held. And some of these reserves were later also pumped into the Belt and Road project. But that's a symbiotic relationship ran into trouble. What started to happen? Well, let's think a bit about what went before and the implication that had for BRICS. Before that, in the 2000s, we saw Lula da Silva in Brazil becoming president. Very progressive president, introduced things like the Bolsa Familia that, with grants to families, and he looked very much to inclusive economic growth. Very similar to what President Mbeki did in South Africa with expansion of grants. And we had, like Brazil, we had very high economic growth, 3.5% to 5%. In Russia, young Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s put out a hand of friendship to the West. And in India, Manmohan Singh became prime minister. He was from the Indian Congress Party, which is a cousin of the African National Congress. The Congress in the two names are not a coincidence. There's a long history going back. And he introduced much needed reforms. So in the 2000s, all of that progressiveness is what led up to the creation of BRICS. There was a shared progressive agenda to some extent. But then things started to turn sour. First of all, Xi Jinping became president of China in 2013, and he became politically much more assertive, much more nationalist. So he started to build islands in South China Sea. We've seen much more noise about Taiwan. And I think today to say that there's a Cold War between the US and China is not an exaggeration. Domestically, Xi, of course, also pursued a much more clamped downish type of policy. You know, with Hussein mentioned the Uyghurs, there's Hong Kong, which flies in all the agreements of 50 years of separate rule for Hong Kong. All of that went out of the window. In India, as Hussein also mentioned, Narendra Modi became prime minister. He's pro-business, but he's is very Hindu nationalist, also rising, you know, all the policy measures that against Muslims that increase sectarian pressure. Dilma Rousseff, who succeeded Lula in Brazil, was ousted in 2000 and, what was it, 14 or 16? And was replaced by Michel Temer, and then replaced by Bolsonaro, who is very, very right-wing, also very nationalist. So we have a situation where basically, you know, you have 4 of the 5 BRICS countries with very nationalist governments. But they're not necessarily singing from the same hymn sheet. 2 of them see a revived Cold War, Russia versus the US, China versus the US. But the 2 others who are also nationalists see closer ties with the US. You have the quartet, which is basically India together with Israel, with the US and UAE. You have the Quad, which is basically Australia, India, Japan, and the US. So you see India playing to both sides a bit. They are in BRICS, but they're also trying to continue and building up closer links with the US. Brazil, the same thing. They are in BRICS, but you also see much closer relationships with the US. You know, the Trump administration described them as a major non-NATO ally. Now, we'll see what happens in Brazil later I think it's this year, where they have an election. Lula is again a candidate, and we'll see who wins that election. And Lula has come out very strongly against Zelensky in the Russia-Ukraine war, for instance. So what I'm saying is that we have increased nationalism, and what that means for BRICS. What does that mean for BRICS? So I think that today, even though despite all the increased business and academic cooperation between these countries, and we also work with, you know, universities in India, with universities in Russia, and so on. But I think ideologically, BRICS is probably weaker, because that progressive agenda that we saw initially that drove the creation of BRICS to represent the global south has gone out of the windows to some extent because these countries have nationalist agendas that they drive. And of course, don't forget that this also plays in with the nationalism in the global north. Trump is a nationalist. And if I see what the low ratings that Biden has, the Republicans might have a comeback in November's elections. And Trump himself, well, we'll see what happens in 2024. So I think there's a lot of that nationalism, and these nationalisms feed against each other and undermines the symbiotic relationship that we saw earlier. So what does that mean for South Africa? I think we need to tread carefully. So we need the investments from both the US and from China and from India. So we need to play this carefully, and the non-aligned element there might need some emphasis going forward to ensure that we don't tread on toes, and to ensure that we are not the little mouse being treaded on by all the big elephants in the park. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Philippe, for that perspective. So you were a little bit more careful, and we should be a little bit more cautious. I'll come back to some of the points that you mentioned. But let's hand over to Ms Motimele.
Answer for the introduction. I want to offer a more sociological or people-centered provocation to the lecture given by Ambassador Sooklal. So 2 parts of the abstract that really stood out for me were the fact that you mentioned the values of the global north. So a focus that stretches beyond the political and economic, which often totalize the imagination of how we think about inter- and intrastate engagement. The second was your assertion that there's been considerable progress in cooperation amongst BRICS countries, not only in terms of the political and the economic and financial, but importantly in terms of the social and people-to-people cooperation. So that's what I'd like to bring my focus to this afternoon, on the people that make up the populations of the BRICS countries. What is the potential on the ground in the everyday lived realities of citizens of the BRICS member states with this potential restructuring of the world order? In particular, with the focus on youth, labor, and women, as a way of framing 3 of the sites of precarity and vulnerability that I see threatening the potential of a new BRICS global order to be rooted in the values of equality and social justice. I think it's extremely important to note that from its inception, BRIC and then BRICS, there's been a strong, clear push towards not framing the group as one that is an anti-NATO alternative strategic alliance emerging from a different geopolitical location. So we were not aiming for a NATO from the south. So a BRICS reconfiguration of global power is not simply about allowing new players into the field of global dominance, but an attack on the idea of hegemony itself. And you see the word multipolar across BRICS statements and articulations, signaling that what was imagined is both the decentralization and diversification of power. So placing BRICS then within a genealogy that begins at the Bandung Conference of 1955, which really puts on the table issues of self-determination through decolonization, non-aggression, equality, and an end to racial oppression globally. In recent times, though, there's also been developments with regards to how we understand security and insecurity. If we suspend for a moment the interstate level and zoom in on the people like I'm going to suggest that we should, we see that the most pressing and precarious forms of insecurity are food insecurity, bodily insecurity in terms of proximity to harm, and job employment insecurity. In 2019, a national household survey showed that 1.1 million school-age children were out of school in Brazil, with the dominant category being those between the ages of 15 and 17. And we know the trend when the increasing number of those unemployed and inactive are youth. And majority of them were Black, brown, and indigenous young people, mapping the growing levels of educational exclusion onto broader social inequalities. By November 2020, that number had grown to 5 million young people between the ages of 6 to 17 without access to education. In 2017, Brazil was identified as one of the most homicidal countries in the world, with 60,000 deaths a year, more than the total from terrorist killings around the world, and South Africa is close behind. These high levels of homicide see young, poorly educated, predominantly black males as being both the dominant perpetrators and victims as well. So we see in Brazil the effects of concentrated forms of disadvantage. I had the privilege of being in Sao Paulo in 2016 as a group of South African students who went to go discuss the similarities and divergences amongst the school occupation movement that was happening there, and was around to see the violent response to Fora Tema protests in the wake of Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. A recent article in South Africa claimed that 11% of the South African population is hungry and food insecure. That number rises to 35% in places like Gauteng. Again, the chances of being in these groups is increased by one's unemployment status, race, gender, and level of education. The consumer price inflation is simply unaffordable, and the current structure of our social interventions severely lacking in providing the necessary relief. I'm interested to know what impact a global restructuring will have on those who continue to die daily because of a lack of access to food, because of the prevalence of violence and the failing of national politics and capitalism globally. The International Labour Organization provides the following data with regards to BRICS countries. 9.8% of adult and 28.4% of the youth labor force was underutilized in 2019. By underutilized, they state that the people were either unemployed, underemployed, or not in employment despite being interested in working, but constrained by existing conditions. Secondly, the ILO reports that the gender gap in labor force participation rate stood at 28.5% in 2020 and was projected to increase substantially in 2021. The youth unemployment rate across BRICS countries has increased continuously since 2010 and reached a record high of 20.5% in 2021. Lastly, that the share of youth who fall into the category of NEET, which stands for not in employment, education, or training, increased from 14% in 2019 to 16.1% in 2020. And for women, these numbers are from 36.2% to 36.8%. So to conclude, a global order shaped by heteropatriarchal capitalism is bound to exclude, exploit, and exterminate those who remain in its underclass or assumed as its surplus, regardless of the distribution of its polarity and the diversification of the dominant players. What in the BRICS imagining of a new global order speaks to these issues?
Thank you very much, Ms. Motimele. Very, very good. I want to probably also try to get the audience in at some point. I want to probably direct one question to you as a sort of a summary from my perspective from the responses. But if one or two people can think about a question in the meantime and just give an indication, then I'll come back to you. So Ambassador Sooklal, it seems to me that listening to your presentation, listening to Hussein, he in fact make the comment, does BRIC make sense? And he's arguing why he's saying so, and he's obviously not saying that he's in fact saying it doesn't make sense. What Philippe is indicating is that when the BRICS were formed, the leaders in those countries were, and the thinking was very progressive. Some changes has happened subsequently. You have a much more nationalist agenda that's coming through, and what he's saying, we should be a little bit more cautious in terms of what we could expect from a BRICS agenda, and also how do we engage with the other countries within BRICS, and there might be potential risks for South Africa. And I think what Ms Motimele is saying is coming back to a remark that you said in your conclusion, that BRICS are really about people. Is about people. But I think what she's trying to articulate in terms of the challenges that each of those countries had with respect to people. How does the agenda of BRICS will be and are dealing with those aspects that has been raised? And then, so there are probably about sort of 3 key areas, but ultimately coming back to, is there still value within the BRICS arrangement? And how do we feel and how do we see the changes and the challenges that we have in the different countries being addressed? And then I've got a follow-up question, but in the meantime, I'll look to see whether there are any questions from the audience. Have you got your mic there? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you to all the 3 colleagues for your very insightful comments. Let me start with Prof Solomon and why I have a serious problem. You see, I'm both a diplomat and an academic. So in one sense, I'm constrained as a diplomat, but as an academic, I have that freedom. Now, when you have someone as an academic as Prof Solomon, human rights is universal, indivisible. Wherever you have violations of human rights, you have to stand up and speak out against it. That was one of the key pillars that President Mandela made as our foreign policy. Doesn't matter even if it's in a friendly country, you should speak out. South Africa has spoken out about the plight of the Uyghurs. But what troubles me in the input of Prof Solomon, he speaks about the Uyghurs, yes. He speaks about the BJP government and nationalism. Remember that government was chosen through the ballot system in a democracy of 1.4 million people. Not once, twice. So it's not pointing fingers at the Modi government. You are saying to the Indian electorate, you have something wrong with your head. That twice you have voted for this party by over 60% to come to power. So when you personalize it to a party and a personality, it's no longer about the people that's voting for that party. It's like saying there's something wrong in your head, putting the ANC into power. That's what you are saying. That's what Prof Solomon is saying. Why is he silent about Afghanistan? What is going on with the women in Afghanistan today? Why is he silent? Why is he silent about the autocracies and monarchies in the Middle East? In the past 3 decades, I have traveled to every country several times over. And I have friends there. They live in fear. The position of women in these countries. Why is he silent? Why is he silent about Pakistan and how they treat minorities? Why is he silent about what happened last year in October in Bangladesh, where a minority community was razed to the ground, the places of worship, women were raped and abused? Is it because he's speaking for a specific constituency? And you can't have human rights, being a human rights advocate and champion if you are dispassionate. I come from a Hindu-Buddhist background. I had to deal with the Dalai Lama. The last time Dalai Lama visited South Africa was in 2005. I handled that visit. When Madiba passed away, the Dalai Lama wanted to come here. I was given instruction. I was sent to Delhi to go and say he must not set foot here. It pained me, but that was my personal feeling. I'm representing the government of South Africa. I must put aside my personal views. So that is what I'm saying to you as an academic. Be dispassionate. Look at human rights across the world, not because it affects my community or my people. Then you are doing exactly what the Western world is doing today. The way he speaks about BRICS, it's as if I'm listening to the commentary of someone from the Bush administration or someone from the European Union. It's no different, no different. And yes, we have problems as South Africa with this government, with this ANC-led government. I'm a member of the ANC, and I speak out. Now imagine if we, the people, didn't have faith in our country. Yes, we have power outages. We have potholes all over the place. We can't provide water. We can't provide housing. We are a very young democracy. Don't forget that. We're not even 3 decades old. We are learning about leadership. We have our own leadership struggles. But it is us, the people, and that's why I said people-centered development. We must put the leaders in position of leadership to steer this fantastic country forward with such great potential. Now imagine if the Chinese in the 1960s, under Chairman Mao, when the Cultural Revolution came about, the thousands of Chinese that were killed, relegated to the farms to go and work and serve. Even the current president, President Xi, go and read his history. He served in extreme hardship in being sent to the rural areas to go and learn farming and so forth. If they didn't have faith in the country and put the energy to build the country, what would have happened to China? With all the problems that China have, the fact of the matter, the Chinese people have chosen the Communist Party. If they don't want it, they can rise up. As I said, Indonesia, the people rose up and got rid of Suharto after 30 years. You have seen a number of revolutions. It's the people that determine the leadership you put in place. So if we have put bad leadership in place, we must suffer the consequences. If we want this country to change, and this country has an abundance of talent, an abundance of leadership. We can change it. I have faith in South Africa, even though as a civil servant and a member of a political party, I have faith that we can change South Africa. But we are very young, we are learning, give us time. China only started kicking in 78. 49, they became the People's Republic of China. It took them 3-4 decades before they found the feet. I will tell you, even the current ambassador and many of my Chinese, I've traveled to China, throughout China over the past 30 years. I know China perhaps better than my own continent. I know of rich Chinese, including the past few ambassadors, who would tell me the clothes they should get from Singapore, from the cousins, old clothes. They didn't have money to buy clothes. They would have one meal a day, one bowl of rice a day. That's the poverty they've risen up. China has lifted 700-800 million people out of poverty. We can do the same in Africa. We can do the same in South Africa. Yes, systems of governance differ. And we don't have relationships with governments. Governments come and go. Your Bolsonaro, your Temer will come and go. Your Lula will come and go. Your Ramaphosa will come and go. Your Zuma will come and go. Your Mbeki will come and go. But we have relationship between countries and between peoples. And that's where we need to put our faith in. Governments will come and go. Do we break diplomatic relations because there's been a change in government? Brazil will go to the poll on the 2nd of October. All likelihood, Lula is going to come back to power. Because Lula is there, are we going to break that relationship? No, our relationship is constant. It's between governments. Take away the voice of BRICS with all its faults. What do you have? Who champions a global South? We are not strong enough as Africa. The African Union is young. Africa accounts for less than 3% of global trade. We don't have the political muscle, nor the economic might, nor the military might. Today, might is measured in terms of military might, political might, and more increasingly technological might. We lack on all three. These countries of the South that are emerging, they have all three. Why is there fear about the rise of China? And let me remind you, before the Industrial Revolution, for 2,000 years, go and look up your history. For 2,000 years, the global economy was dominated firstly by India and then by China. The population, according to the UN, at the end of this century, Africa and Asia will account for 89% of global population. Almost 1 in 9 human beings is either going to be Asian or African. The European and Americans will make up 14. Whether we like it or not, demographics is going to change, and with changing demographics, you're going to have a changed political environment and a changed global high table. Thank you.
Let me just check whether there's a burning question or two from the audience. Is there? Okay, if you can just introduce yourself if you ask the question. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Prof, and thank you very much, Ambassador, for the quite insightful presentation. My name is Jerry Toga, and having listened to your presentation, I think it was quite insightful, and I'd like to know Having followed some international politics that have happened recently, I would want to check, does the different positions that different member countries of BRICS take on international politics, like what has happened at Ukraine, different positions that you take. For example, you'd have South Africa that abstain in the voting council on a position that, on the discussion of the thing that that Russia has been involved in war with Ukraine. Those different perspectives that they take in positions, do they influence the internal discussions towards decision making on the economy and other perspectives within the member countries of BRICS? And that is number one. And also just number two, I would just like to get your perspective on the idea of a united Africa, a one currency Africa. Would you think that if we were to have an Africa that has one currency, would it position it in a better, much competitive scale at a global scale or not? But thank you for that insightful presentation. I would like to hear your thoughts on those two perspectives. Thank you.
Anybody else in the audience? There's one at the back there. So Jerry was former SRC president. Okay.
Good day. It's Matume Mugwena from the International Office. This question, thank you, first of all, Prof, for the presentation. This question goes out to our rector. Based on the presentation by the Prof that said that there's no university in South Africa or in Africa that is a BRICS center, can the UFS take this challenge and consider opening a BRICS center that will be the first one in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? There was one over there.
Hello, I'm Yana. I'm from the University of the Free State here. The one question that I just want to ask in terms of how BRICS can relate to Africa's economic development. I understand initiatives such as the BRI, etc., that's being promoted by China, is currently playing a very integral role within our industrialization and moving our economy forward. So my question would like to be essentially is how will BRICS give Africa the tools to empower itself within an economic perspective? Thank you.
Let's take a last question, a final question from the audience.
Thank you very much. This is Gambili. A question to the ambassador. When is BRICS starting their own payment system? When is BRICS starting their own payment system away from the SWIFT?
Their own what system?
Payment system.
Payment?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to ask the ambassador to respond to those, and then I'm going to ask my two panelists if they want to make a final comment or two, and then I'm going to wrap it up at the end. And I just wanted to say, Ambassador Professor Hussein Solomon didn't run away. I think he had probably a lecture commitment or class commitment, and that's the reason why he isn't here. All right, over to you.
Colleagues, for those very interesting questions. Let me, Jerry, firstly start with your question on differences within BRICS, for example, the Ukraine situation, and there have been other situations. What we have within BRICS, because remember it is us at the Sherpa level that negotiate and agree positions and put forward to our ministers and our heads of state, what we call red lines. Now, these red lines are almost sacred. And a country is very upfront on the red lines. If any one of us feel discomfort with a certain position that the other BRICS countries are putting forward, then we all pull back. We work by consensus. So even though we had different positions, and as was pointed out by Prof Burger, Brazil have two conflicting positions. Bolsonaro did an about turn. First he came, remember 2 weeks before the war, he was with Putin. Bolsonaro went to Russia. They depend heavily. Remember, you know, when the BRICS acronym was created, the B stood for Brazil as being the agricultural center of the world, because that's Brazil's strength. Russia as the gas station of the world. India as the backroom headquarters of the world. China as the manufacturing floor of the world. And South Africa and Africa as the reserve of commodities. Put it very crudely. So Bolsonaro put out a statement that they will not criticize Russia. But the Itamaraty, the foreign ministry, put out a totally different statement. So even looking at when we spoke to our mission in New York of how South Africa would vote on the General Assembly resolution, we were told that Brazil will abstain. But the last moment Brazil did an about turn. And that's the tension between the president and the foreign ministry. That's why I say we have relations with countries. Because I can tell you, if Lula comes back, BRICS was the brainchild of Lula as well. You're going to see a very different role from Brazil within BRICS, a very strengthened role from Lula. So the differences are managed. One currency for Africa, we have been discussing this for quite some time. We've been discussing a common passport for the whole of Africa so that we don't have problems that we experience. But we have to be incremental. You saw what happened in Europe. You know, I was in Europe when the expansion happened. And many were not happy at the pace of expansion. And that's why you saw now the pullout of the UK. And had Le Pen won the recent elections in France, she was also speaking out of pulling out of the EU. So the EU is not the module we should follow. We should be incremental. Ultimately, if we can get to a common currency, that will be fantastic for Africa, but it should be a gradual process. So we're now looking at trade integration. You need strong trade amongst ourselves. Inter-Africa trade is less than, it's about 16-17%. If you look at the rest of the world, Asia is around 65%, the Americas around 60%, EU is about 68%. We are 18% or so. We are saying that by 2035, through the AFCTA, we'll be at double the figure, at 110% of the current figure. So we're on the right track. So let's get first these fundamentals right before we speak of a common currency. BRICS Center, you have the... I'm a full supporter for it. BRICS and Africa's development. You would see in my paper, I didn't get time to go through it. Every time we chaired, it was about Africa. And even Mr. Pando, 2 weeks ago, I had to go present to Cabinet our preparations for our chairship next year. The message was very clear. In both the summits, we've had a very strong Africa focus. We tried to do two things: to mainstream Africa's development issues and to also coordinate, because all of our BRICS partners have major programs in Africa. China, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. India has the India-Africa Forum Summit. You have the Latin America-Africa Summit. And Russia hosted in 2019 the first Russia-Africa Summit, and in October this year in St. Petersburg, they'll host the second Russia-Africa Summit. What we are saying, let there not be a scramble for Africa. All of you as BRICS partners have a role to play in Africa's development, but we don't want you to use Africa as the competition ground and to be destructive, but work in partnership in seeing us materialize Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. So we continue. Of course, there are tangible benefits. The BRICS Bank, Egypt is now a member. We're going to open up to more African countries. Thus far, we have only lent to BRICS countries for infrastructure project. The first project outside of a BRICS country was the Highland Water Project that is now being funded by the New Development Bank with Lesotho. But it's going to, these are the mechanisms we're putting in place. BRICS payment system, yes. We signed an inter-BRICS currency agreement about 2 or 3 years ago so that we can start trading in a common currency. Now, given these sanctions around the SWIFT system and where it hurts us, and this is not the first time, the unilateral sanctions on Iran that was placed there by the EU and US hurt us badly. When those sanctions were placed in 2012, we were buying almost 1/3 of our oil from Iran because our refineries are configured to Iran oil. The other oil, the offset in refining is not as much as the Iranian suited oil. Our refineries were configured because under the apartheid system, you had very strong relations with the Shah of Persia and the apartheid government. They helped us build these refineries suited to the system. So it hurt us, secondary sanctions. The same thing is happening now. It hurts us. So there has been some discussion. I know in the finance track, when they met about 2 months ago, they have been starting discussions on this to break away from the stranglehold that the dollar has on global trade. And that's part of the contestation. The SDR, special drawing rights of the IMF, the second largest global currency after dollar and EU, I mean third largest, is the Chinese renminbi. And the Chinese renminbi is going to get more weighty and overtake the euro in a matter of time, like it has overtaken the Swiss franc and the pound. And this is where the contestation is happening. It's not just about China, it's about countries of the South rising. It is predicted that by 2028, China will be our largest global economy. Even if it doesn't happen by 2028, I can tell you by 2030 it will happen. India has overtaken the colonizer. India's economy last year became larger than that of the UK. By 2032, India is predicted to be the third largest global economy. So these factors will change the globe, irrespective of whether the North likes it or not. You can't take away from the fact of the rising South. That's the reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm gonna just check with Mosibudi and Philippe. Mosibudi, are there some final comments you would like to make?
I think the final comment I would make is that in addition to economic institutions and political cooperation and participation, something I take faith from is that all these BRICS countries also have a really long, really important history of people's power. So when we think about the ways in which this restructuring is going to reproduce particular problematic power relations that continue to exclude and marginalize particular types of people, I have faith in the fact that the type of cooperation we'll see will extend to resistance movements as well, and the type of rising up of people who are outside of these institutions in holding BRICS accountable.
Philippe?
Yeah. So, yes, I agree BRICS should, BRICS countries have a role to play in Africa and particularly development. But I also do think that we, in a sense, in the next decade, we will see a more bifurcated world, a world with a Cold War between China and the US. And we need to be very careful not to be caught up in that. So what we need to guard against is BRICS being seen ideologically, if representing the global South should not become representing China. It should not be seen as an extension of China. And that BRICS therefore needs to be against the US or the EU. I think in that sense we can take a lesson from, even though I agree with the ideology of the Modi type of government or the Bolsonaro government, I think we can take a lesson from what the sort of independence that they strive to, they would go with the US in the Quad, but also buy cheap oil from the Russians, if I look at what India did in the last 2 or 3 months. So they play a very careful role to maintain their independence, and I think we will have to do the same thing and be very careful that this neighborhood in which we play, given with the rise of nationalism in both the global north and the global south, the neighborhood is becoming a bit more volatile. You're quite correct in the, is it the VUCA term that you used? That's the neighborhood we're going to play in. And Marine Le Pen, and it was, it was close call, or she won. We'll see what happened with Trump. But we need to be very careful. We'll see more of these things come up and down, and and again. So Lula might come in again, but then it remains volatile. Yes, we maintain relationships with countries, but those leaders are, the effect they have is not necessarily just transitory, as we now see with Putin. The effect can be quite devastating, and we need to realize that what some of these BRICS countries are doing, like Russia at the moment with the war, is putting enormous strain on the price of grain and maize and oil and fertilizers, and who's hurting most? It's Africa that's hurting most because of those prices.
Okay. Right, thank you very much, Philippe. And just a response on the BRICS Center. That is something that I think we definitely would look into. I can't give you a commitment here on the stage, but I think there is a challenge that the ambassador has put forward to the University of the Free State, and we will definitely look into that. It's actually quite difficult to summarize the discussion, and but what is quite clear is that within BRICS there are weaknesses and there are strengths, and one have to recognize that, and one have to appreciate it, and as long as we know what those are, because if you know what those weaknesses are and what those strengths are, you can then navigate much more realistically to an outcome. I think economically and politically, that will also be part of the mix, and we've listened to the fact that politically, there are country engagements that needs to happen, but I think the important message that I got from the discussion here, besides the weaknesses and the strength, is that we should try to focus the global South voice on the people. The people in those different countries, that will probably shape much more specific agenda, and we mustn't try to play the global South against the global North. I think we need to understand what is the value and what we want to give to the people in the global South. And then I think if we go with that sort of approach into strengthening the BRICS, understanding where the weaknesses are, the deficiencies are, and also the strengths are, BRICS could play that specific role that I think it was ultimately intended for. When it was conceptualized. So from my side, Ambassador Sooklal, it was fantastic. We can probably have spent much more longer time here. I would have liked to have seen more students here, but we know that they're preparing for the exams. But I can just imagine the sort of wealth of engagements that could happen and can still happen going forward. And we certainly wouldn't like to see this as your last visit to the University of the Free State, and perhaps if we decide that there is going to be a BRICS Center or BRICS unit here, we would like to invite you more for this type of discussion. So I would like to say thank you very much to you, to our panelists, and all of the best for the future. And we as the university would like and probably will get in terms of collaborating, interacting more with some of the activities that happen under the BRICS umbrella. Thank you very much indeed. And we can give the ambassador and the panel a hand of applause. I think there's something small, Ambassador, that I want to hand over to you from the University of the Free State. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, and that brings us to the end of the session. And thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the program director. And enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And to those students in the audience, all the best with your examinations. Thank you.